My name is Eric Jacobson. I'm the program director at Right on Sports. And Right on Sports is a camp and after school program dedicated to helping middle school students and now high school students increase their confidence and interest in writing by giving them opportunities to write about topics that they're interested in. In this case, we focus on sports. Could be music, could be fashion, could be politics. But for our purposes, we're talking about sports. The people that created Right on Sports were Byron Yake, who's a former AP sports editor. And all of the staff members of Right on Sports have some interest in sports. We draw on our own background. The idea of Right on Sports is really giving students an opportunity to pick their own topics. So often in school, students are told what to write. Read this book, write this essay, read this poem, write this essay. But in Right on Sports, we really let students pick what they want to write about. So we get students writing about a favorite team or a favorite player, but we also get students doing analysis of different leagues. And students certainly write about social justice issues that are in the news. So 2 years ago during the Women's World Cup, a lot of students wrote about sexism in sports and how the women's team was being paid less than the men's team and playing on less than optimal field conditions. 2 years before that, the Men's World Cup, lots of talk about racism in soccer and racism in sports. So Right on Sports students really take on sports in a lot of different directions. So this is our first episode of the Right on Sports Roundtable, and I'm very happy that you've joined us for this inaugural edition. So the idea of this series is to try to, once a month or so, have a conversation focused on a relevant topic. So in honor of African American History Month, we are having this roundtable on African American sports history and how it connects to African American history more broadly in terms of civil rights, in terms of social justice issues, and the role that it has played both locally and nationally. So we may hit some bumps in the road technically, so please bear with us. This is the first time that we're doing this, but I'm glad that you've joined us here today. We have two guests and one host. So I'd like the first guest to introduce himself, and it's Mr. Clarence McKnight, who is a Negro League historian. Clarence, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Clarence McKnight. How you doing? I'm a historian based on Negro League stuff, all type of Black history, and I do it through my stamp collection. And I got involved with the Negro League about maybe 10 years ago, collecting the memorabilia, posters, signed autograph, baseballs, baseball cards and things like that. And I have a few things that I acquired a couple of weeks ago. I have I collect stamps. So I have some stamp stuff as an envelope that has painting, painting on it. So I have that some first. So I have some of those that's hand painted also too as part of my collection. And I do displays all over the place. I have a display at Yogi Berra Museum now. It's been there since last March. I have two glass cubicles of stuff, which includes some plates for Jackie Robinson, like Hallmark plates, things like that. 50th anniversary of him breaking the color barrier.
Great, thanks, Clarence. Thanks for giving us some of your time today. The other guest is Dean Leslie Wilson of Montclair State, eminent historian. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Leslie Wilson. I'm a professor of history and also the associate dean at Montclair State. I'm a history of African American history, mostly of the 19th and 20th centuries, and I'm also an avid sports fan, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
All right, thanks for spending your Saturday morning with us. And last but not least is our host for the day, Elan Lakes. So Elan joined us first as a camper. So he came to, I believe, 3 years in a row as a camper. And then he readily transitioned into being an intern, and he's been an intern with us for the last few years. So we're very, very happy that Elan is still with us, an important part of the team. Having interns, we think, is a really crucial part of Right on Sports because they draw on their experience as students and think about what we can do to modify and adapt the curriculum. We believe that our curriculum is an evolving document, right? It's not stuck in amber. Every year we try to modify it and grow it and change it. And one of the ways that we grow it and changing it is talking to our interns and talking to our students. We're really committed to the idea of a generative curriculum, and that wouldn't happen without the honest insights of folks like Elan. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elan, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thanks, Elan.
Thank you, Dr. J, for that great introduction. So first question is, what should people understand about the Negro League?
This is for me, for Clarence. Basically,
Yes.
to understand that the Negro League started in 1920. And it started because Black players wasn't allowed to play in the major league at the time. And so they formed their own league. 1920, it was done by Reuben, oh my God, Reuben, I can't think of his last name right now, call it blank. But it started at a YMCA, and it started there. We had a few teams, then they went from there. And one of the problems they had was, as a league, was traveling all over the place, not finding a place to stay in, sometimes not finding a stadium. You know, they played them with anything, anywhere they could play, anywhere they can play. And hotels, they stayed at people's homes, slept in their cars. Later on, when they got a bus, they slept on the bus. And it was very hard for them, but they kept on going. And they were some of the best players came out that league.
So I guess my next question is, what Negro League connections are there to Newark and local NJ history, just to kind of bring it close to home?
But bringing it close to home is that a lot of players, you had a lot of players play in the area there. You have Marty Irving. You have a couple more people too. My mind's kind of foggy right now. But basically in Newark, a lot of the teams from New York also played over there sometimes too. You had the Cuban team in New York. You had a couple more teams, a team from Long Island that played over there too. Some players played there like Larry Doby. Josh Gibson also played over there at one time too. Not to play enough to have a game over there at Ripon Stadium over there. So Newark had quite a few prospects, and back in the day, Newark was a huge area for all type of sports, baseball and basketball, things like that. So a lot of people went to the area, and back then, it was a area that was kind of like growing a little bit, during that era, and it was a very popular area for players to come and play.
That's great. So to kind of tie the role of the sports in general, what role have the sports played in Newark in terms of like community building?
Oh well, right now you have the Devils there, and a lot of those teams who was there before. The Nets was there at one time too, and a lot of those teams were doing a lot of community service in the area. Being the homeless, things like that. Supporting the Boys and Girls Clubs, the YMCA, youth groups like that. So a lot of them, they came there. They didn't just go there just to make money. They came there and gave back to the community. They never had a baseball team there, I don't think, other than the Eagles, but no other team was there.
Okay, that's great. So Clarence, I have one more question for you right now. What does this sports history kind of mean to you, kind of taking all of that into context?
Oh, sports history. I mean, I like how the sports have evolved over the years, especially in baseball and things like that. I'm not really a baseball fan, but I like history in general, and how they kind of came out of the area there with some of the players there has really been big role models, gone to the Hall of Fame, things like that. And Newark was the location that people really went to. Like I said before, and have the first woman owner in any type of sports back then was like unbelievable back then. Effie Manley,
All right. So my next question is for Professor Williams. What do you think people should understand about like the distinct experience of Black female athletes dealing with the effects of both racism and sexism?
Okay. It's somewhat of an unusual experience because it depends on how you look at it in what time period. And I think that most people don't contextualize sports in time periods. So if we look at Black female athletes in the past, and when I say in the past, let's say the past 100 years, it's very different than if we look at it in, let's say, the past 20 years or the past 30 years. In the past 30 years, we see racism and sexism in a completely different way. When we look in the past 100 years, we see it in a different challenge. So if I could go back into the part of the question that you asked Clarence earlier, what I think is so important about what he said is that there was a community building in the 1920s because it was a period of the Great Migration. People were moving from the South to the North. There were a lot of Black institutions that were developing that were supporting these athletes as they came into these new sports. And so a lot of the different places that were developing where sports teams, particularly the Negro Leagues, were developing, were supportive of athletes, but they were supportive of male athletes. They weren't necessarily supportive of female athletes. And when you get to the 1950s, there is a bigger push for Black female athletes. The institutions are not there in the same way. So there is a different level of sexism. Even though there's a second migration, there's not that same development of institutional building to support those people. And it becomes much more complex. There is a greater need for Black female amateur athletes than professional athletes in the 1950s, right? So there are some Black amateur tennis players, and there are a lot of Black amateur athletes who are going to go to the Olympics, but they're not going to be paid. There is no sponsorship of Black amateur athletes at that point, right? That comes in the 70s. So these people need the community to a large extent to support them. And there's not that same degree of financial support of these athletes. It's basically like a mom and pop type of thing. Someone knows you, they support you, but it's not the whole community supporting you. So if you look in New Jersey, we have Althea Gibson as a tennis player, for example. A lot of people know of her now, but that support that she needed was not there at a widespread moment. But when you get to the 90s and the current time period, there is a different type of level of financial support because amateurs can be supported. And then when they turn pro, they get even additional support. So the level of racism is different because now people can see them in a wider stage. And the sexism is different because now they're being compared to their white peers. And there is a frustration because many of the Black female athletes are doing better on many scales than Black male athletes. And they're also doing better than white male athletes, and they're doing far better than white female athletes. And at the same time, they're also not being compensated to the same level as their peers. So if you look at someone like the Williams sisters, they're not getting compensated the same way. If you look at a lot of the WNBA players, they're not making the same amount of money as their peers in the NBA. So there's a great deal of racism and sexism, and it's promoted differently than it was 50 or even 100 years earlier. Sort of a long answer, but I hope I answered the question.
Great answer to a great question asked by Penelope, a Right on Sports student. So kind of to tie the last question to my next one, I wanted to ask Mr. Wilson, what do you think athlete activism has looked like for Black female athletes? Or like, how does it differ a little bit?
I think it's been very different. Black female athletes have been willing to sacrifice their careers for causes. And in the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of athletes sacrifice their careers in different ways. And when we talk about that compensation issue, that's really important, largely because they aren't making the same type of money. They're not getting the same type of endorsements. And in many cases, their protests are causing them to lose endorsements or causing them to lose their salaries. But what are they focusing on? They're focusing on police brutality. They're focusing on different levels of inequality. They're looking at poverty. They're looking at mistreatment of women. They're looking at gender differences. I think there are a lot of issues. They're not just racial issues. I think there are a whole host of issues that cut across different bandwidths.
Are there any particular athletes that have caught your attention, like for their willingness to sacrifice their endorsements and other components?
Two groups in particular. In the WNBA, the Atlanta Dream, because they came out and they campaigned basically against their owner, Kelly Loeffler.
I remember that. That was
in support of Reverend Warnock for the Senate seat. And then Maya Moore, who plays in the WNBA for the Minnesota team, the Lynx. She hasn't played for the past 2 years. She's been fighting for the freedom of a young man who was incarcerated and given a long sentence for a crime he didn't commit and was recently freed. So those are two that stand out to me too. Cases.
Yes, I could also extend that question to Mr. McKnight. Like, are there athletes, in particular female athletes, that have stood out to you for their activism?
I would say the Williams sisters, they have done a little bit, not a lot, but they've done some. And I would say also too, the young man who kneeled in football. I mean, he lost everything. And people didn't realize that basically he wasn't protesting the American flag or our country. He was protesting what was going on. And a lot of people took that the wrong way. They took it as you against America, but he was not. But they didn't listen to what he was saying. All they saw with him, that knee, and Matthew, before he did that, he spoke to someone who was in the military. So that's the way you honor a fallen soldier. Sometimes you kneel and you pray. I remember some years ago, there was a football player, I forgot, he was a defensive player. No, what's this guy's name? Anyway, it was a quarterback. And he kneeled and prayed on the football field. No one said anything, you know what I mean? No one said anything at all. But right away, they took him and said, I mean, the guy lost everything. And still to this day, other things have happened in this country, they still see him as being non-American. And they see most athletes who protest as non-Americans. That doesn't make any sense because everyone have a right to protest. That's all right, freedom of speech. No matter what occupation you may have, you still have the right to protest. Because you made $1 million mean that you can't protest, things like that. And the sad part about it is that they're picking on sports where mostly the athletes are Black. Basketball and football. You don't say anything about hockey or baseball like that. They protest, but not saying that much. You know, I mean, come on, give us a break. Look at everybody as have been not said equal, but have the opportunity to protest. They want to protest. Don't knock them down. I mean, this guy have donated money to charities all over the world, and yet they still smack him in the face saying you are un-American. It's shameful, really. It is.
It is, and that kind of that's a pretty good segue into my next question. So, do you think there's like, I guess I'll ask Mr. Wilson first. Do you think there's a difference in reception based on who's saying it, like in the WA versus the men's NBA? Because we kind of touched on this a little bit, but.
Yes, I do think there's a difference, and I agree with Clarence McKnight entirely. I think that there's a difference in terms of race, and there's a difference in terms of gender. It's very obvious, and it might be driven by sponsorship. It might be driven by politics. It might be driven by a whole lot of other conditions, and it would take probably all year to dissect which is really the biggest issue, but there's a difference. The WNBA versus the NBA, there's a clear difference. The WNBA was allowed to do things differently, and maybe because people did not believe that their viewership was going to be as wide as the NBA. And so they were allowed to put different things on their court last year when they were in the bubble. They were allowed to wear different things on the backs of their uniforms, as opposed to the NBA. And it seemed that some of the NBA players were afraid, depending on what they had on the backs of their jerseys, accompanying their names. So it's sort of like, I might be somewhat afraid, so I'm not going to be all out and be a complete protester. I'll just say like unity. And I'm not trying to pick on any one individual. But if I say unity, it's safer than saying Black Lives Matter. So I'll put unity because I still need my endorsements. I think that some people could be outspoken or more outspoken. So LeBron James could be more outspoken than other people. And he could possibly absorb it more than other people. I think that we are living in a time period, and I go back to Clarence on this, where we should demand that people who are more visible should be willing to protest more and should have the right to protest more. And what we saw was that people who played sports did not protest based on the audience that they had. So there were players in the NHL who protested, but they didn't protest in the same way that the NBA players protested. And the few players of different races in the NHL who protested were given a lot of grief for it. In the major leagues, in Major League Baseball, where you have a lot of Latino players, I figured that they would all come out and protest, and I was somewhat shocked by the degree of limited protest, because I figured, hey, we're all in the same boat. We all should be out there protesting. When they come to get us, they come to get us, right? And they're not saying, like, do you speak Spanish or not? You're a little darker, you're gonna get it. But it didn't turn out that way. So it just seemed that it was largely the NFL and the NBA. And in soccer, where there has been rampant racism, even in Major League Soccer, I was somewhat disappointed there too. Even though there were some degrees of protest, it didn't feel the same to me.
So, like, considering that there are like differing degrees of how much athletes have the ability to speak out, do you believe that, this is for Mr. Wilson, do you believe that it is the duty of Black athletes to use their platform? And is that duty to, and where is that duty necessarily directed at? Like, is the duty to the community? Is it to the sport? Is it to themselves?
That's a hard question, and I think that's a century-based question. I think back in the day, 1920s, that was a way to make a living, right? And that you had a responsibility to your family and to your community on some limited basis because your community was supporting you. So when we look at the Negro Leagues, the community supported the players supported the community. Now when we're looking at athletes who are making multi-millions of dollars, they're getting endorsements, they're selling products, people are buying their products because of those athletes, that relationship has changed a bit. And so now you sort of want those people to have a different relationship. So if I'm wearing your sneakers and your name is on the sneakers and I'm buying them because of you, it somewhat turns around that you have to do something back for me. And if that means supporting my cause, well, there's a conflict, right? Because it means then that you're somewhat beholden to me. And the Michael Jordan rule doesn't hold anymore. You can't just say, well, Republicans buy sneakers too, and I'm going to be apolitical. You have to do something for the community. But the question is, how much and what type of community activism do you have to have? And I think that that's where the problem lies. Everyone has to make their own personal choice. I can't demand that you do something that I want just because I'm buying your product, because I can turn around as a consumer and say, I'm not going to buy your product, right? If you don't do what I expect you to do. But I think that because you are trying to sell product to me in this way of name recognition, that you have to give back in some form. And I think that corporations are forcing that as well, right? So if I'm representing Apple Computers and I'm the CEO of Apple Computers, I'm somewhat forced by my brand to give to the community as well. So it's not just athletes, it's a larger societal issue.
Okay, so I'd like to turn that question to Mr. McKnight as well.
You know, I feel that you really can't push him to protest, because that's kind of personal. I would like him to come out more, but to say such a protest, they're not gonna buy his product, it's not fair to them. Everybody have their own reason for not protesting. It could be economic, it could be they could have signed a special clause in that contract for those sponsors, say, you know what, you can't do this, you can't do that. And they may lose that sponsorship. But I think they should speak out. I mean, years ago, Jim Brown spoke out years ago. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar spoke out years ago during the civil rights movement, and in the 60s, in the 70s, and some part of the 70s, they all spoke out. Back then, there wasn't a lot of crazy endorsements back then, so they really had nothing to lose back then. But now these people think about, well, I'm gonna get how can people fund my big mansion, things like that. They think about those different things. But a person like LeBron James, to him, it doesn't matter, because he's doing from the heart, because he came from an area that was basically, in the ghetto area. So he's looking back and say, well, you know what? I got all this money. What can I do to help people who don't have these things or can't speak for themselves? And the thing about it is that people are going to listen to them when they speak out. Personally, I think they should, but something. But I don't know if they don't, then I'm not going to be against them if they don't, because like I said before, they have other things to think about.
I'm going to ask Mr. Wilson first. Which athlete would you say that functioned as an activist would you say was the most impactful for you, like both let's say like 30 years ago and also referring to now?
Back in the day, I would say Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was the most influential of someone that I grew up with, knew, saw. He was a product of New York, went out to UCLA, graduated, came back, gave to the community, then played for the Bucks, played for the Lakers, was transformative on the court and off the court. Became a great scholar, wrote several books, became a Muslim. I think he did so many different things that it's hard to say that he didn't influence me. But just like Clarence said, Jim Brown clearly had to have an impact too. He retired at the top of his game. And he didn't need to retire. That also had an impact. Harry Edwards, who wasn't really an athlete, but was pivotal in terms of the 1968 Olympics, in terms of encouraging people, also played a role in my consciousness about the role of an athlete and what athletes could or could not do, or what they should or should not do, as a part of a community and as a race activist. In the contemporary society, I feel that I like LeBron James. I'm proud of Colin Kaepernick. I admire him a lot. There are others too, but I would say that at the moment, LeBron James just stands out, just because of all the different things he's been able to do. I think that there are other people who are doing different things in different ways. So for example, Derek Jeter is not one of these people who is very visible, but I think that he's doing things that are very transformative behind the scenes. So I think that you can be an activist in different ways. And I'm just amazed by them. If you were looking at women, I would say the Williams sisters are, you know, they're amazing. And I think that they have transformed tennis for so many African Americans, male and female. And that people have followed in their footsteps, and that they have helped people, you know, in front and behind the scenes, and that they have transformed the way that we look at tennis. Because before them, Black people didn't look at tennis. You know, Tiger Woods has had that impact, but Tiger Woods has never been a race person. He has transformed the sport for Black people, but he's never been a race man. So there are different ways that you can look at activism. And maybe some of that activism is to encourage you to move in a direction, and some of that is to encourage you, to inspire you to do something different with your life and to use your talents in different ways.
That's great. So, Mr. McKnight?
I would say Bill Russell. We played for the Boston Celtics. Muhammad Ali. I would also say too Jackie Robinson. I mean, they have support Martin Luther King mission, you know, things like that. But Ali, I mean, he gave up, gave us probably his career because he didn't want to go into the military, because he to him how we've been treated was unconscionable. And he said, you know what, you want me to go to the military, but look how you treat us. And also too, when they came home, the military, they were treated like not even citizens at all, especially during World War II. You know, they fought over there. They came back. Some of them was even lynched back in the day when they came back. The uniform on, lynched with the uniform on, because that's much disrespect for them. And Bill Russell, he marched with King a few times. Ali didn't, but Ali did some other things, you know, around the country, speaking out against racism. And those are the key people, you know, that caught my eye back in the day, you know, was those two people, you know, with and Jackie Robinson also contribute money to the King movement.
Okay.
And now we'll say like LeBron James. I mean, he putting his money where his mouth is. I mean, he doing a lot of community service stuff. He building homes. I mean, he building a school for kids. I mean, come on, you know, that's the way of giving back. But you can't force everybody to give back. That's the way of giving back, to say, you know what, let me put my money in education, help build these kids' future. Stop with that. Because it starts with the youth. All starts with them.
So to put my own little 2 cents in, I guess I would also say Muhammad Ali was my big athlete activist, because just for what he stood for, what he represented. Because I think there's a tremendous amount of value in having the willingness to put your career on the line, put your livelihood on the line for whatever it is you believe in, and just being that true to your people and being that about whatever your cause is. Because he really was just about being like anti whatever he believed the government was doing that was wrong. And they are like, and then especially comparing him to people kind of like Michael Jordan, there's a lot of value in making sure that you are taking those risks for whatever it is that you know you want from society and what you want your world to look like. And to kind of go off of something that was said earlier, we have a question from Paul Johnson asking Professor Wilson to compare Bill Russell to Jackson in terms of service to the Black community.
That's a hard one. Bo Jackson did a lot too. I think it's understated in a lot of different ways. say two different time periods. It's sort of hard to compare and contrast in that sense. Bill Russell was really an advocate, as Clarence said, for civil rights. And he was important in terms of integration in Boston. You know, Boston was a highly segregated town when he arrived in the 50s. It was a segregated town when he was a player. And it's important to keep in mind that Bill Russell became a player coach, was one of the first Black coaches in the NBA. Bo Jackson was a multi-sport player, but his career was cut short by a terrible injury. Bill Russell had a lengthy career, and after that, he became a visible spokesman. Bo Jackson became a silent activist. He traveled around the country speaking, but he was never a televised type of spokesman, while Bill Russell was. Bill Russell was on camera. Bill Russell was given a lot of time on television. Bill Russell was a commentator when the NBA was on ABC on the weekends back in the day. And so his viewpoints were widely known. Bo Jackson's viewpoints weren't as widely disseminated. So I think that they're two different types of people. So it's sort of hard to compare them. So I'll leave it at that. But both of them are good activists. Hope I did your question justice.
Yeah, I believe you did.
Clarence could maybe add in on that one.
I would say you put it right. Really, I mean, with Bill Russell and Bo Jackson, you know, there's two different ways that they did it. You know, and I think Bill Russell was basically had a very long career, so a lot of people knew him much better than probably Bo. So when he spoke out, people kind of listened to him a little bit more compared to Bo Jackson. Basically, that's all I have to really say. Yeah.
I think that's all the questions I have for today.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Elan, for hosting this inaugural Right on Sports Roundtable. I think you did a really good job. And I think the conversation went in a lot of different directions, and I thought it was really, really interesting and informative. I want to thank Clarence McKnight again for coming and sharing your both knowledge of Negro League history, but African American sports history more broadly, and also your insights and opinions about society and the relationship between sports and society. And I'd also like to thank Dean Wilson for his time and his expertise on both history and I think his honest and open insights into the relationship between sports and politics more broadly. I hope everybody enjoyed this first conversation. And I invite you back next month on March 27th. We're going to have our second Right on Sports Roundtable, and this will focus on women in sports journalism. So in a similar way, we'll be talking about the history and then also a connection between sports and other aspects of our lives, including politics, racial justice, social equity. It will be hosted by Sequoia Hightower, who is a former Right on Sports student, current Right on Sports intern, and will be joined by two female sports journalists. So look for the announcement at the Right on Sports website, and certainly email us at Right on Sports if you have any questions about that. This will be archived on our website, so I encourage you to go back and watch it, and then let other folks know that it's available. So thanks for joining us today. Thanks again, Elan, Clarence, and Leslie, and stay safe, everybody. Take care.